Christine Brown spent years trying to save her marriage. Couples therapy, difficult conversations, public vulnerability on national television, private negotiations that never made it to air. She fought for that relationship the way someone fights for something they genuinely believed in, with everything she had, for longer than most people would have lasted. And while she was doing all of that, while she was still hoping, still strategizing, still trying, her 7-year-old daughter had already written the ending. Children always know. We just never listen carefully enough. If this is your first time on this channel, hit like and subscribe right now, because what we do here is go deeper than the headlines, deeper than the confessionals, deeper than what the network wants you to walk away thinking. You found the right place. Now, let's get into it. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the end, but the actual beginning, because to understand what truly Brown saw, you have to first understand what she was born into. Season 1 of SisterWives introduced the world to something genuinely unusual. Not just a polygamous family, but a family that seemed, against all reasonable expectation, to actually function. Kody Brown was energetic, present, charismatic in that loud and slightly exhausting way that reads as genuine warmth on camera. Christine was funny, she was real. She was the wife who said the quiet parts out loud, who laughed too hard at her own jokes, who clearly adored her children with a kind of fierce, uncomplicated love that came through the screen effortlessly. In those early seasons, the Christine and Kody dynamic had something in it. You could see it. There were moments, real ones, not performed ones, where Kody made Christine laugh in a way that reached her eyes, where they were clearly in on something together. Some shared jokes about their life, their chaos, their enormous blended family. Those moments were real. I'm not revising them out of existence just because the story ended badly. They happened. And truly Brown was born into the tail end of that version of her parents. That's the thing that makes her story so specific and so painful. She didn't grow up watching a marriage that was already hollow. She caught the very last frames of something that had once been genuine, just before the film ran out. She is young enough that those early memories are soft and indistinct, but old enough that she was fully conscious and absorbing everything by the time the deterioration became impossible to ignore. That timing is not incidental. It is the entire architecture of what she experienced. Here is something that child development researchers have documented extensively and that most people intuitively understand but never quite articulate clearly enough. Children do not need language to comprehend emotional reality. They do not need someone to sit them down and explain that a marriage is failing. They read it in the body. They read it in the temperature of a room when a particular person walks in or doesn't walk in. They read it in the half-second hesitation before a parent answers a question. They read it in which topics produce silence and which produce a specific kind of careful cheerfulness that is its own form of alarm bell. Children as young as 5 and 6 years old can detect fundamental relational instability between their parents, with an accuracy that would surprise most adults. Not because they are precocious or unusually intelligent, though truly Brown appears to be both, but because their survival instincts are calibrated to exactly this kind of information. A child's entire world is their family. Of course they develop extraordinary sensitivity to its tremors. Truly Brown grew up in a household where the emotional temperature dropped measurably across seasons. You can chart it if you watch closely. The way Kody's visits to Christine's home changed in frequency, in duration, in quality. The way Christine began navigating conversations about Kody with a careful neutrality that was clearly effortful. The way the children, truly especially because she was the youngest and the least trained in the art of performing normalcy, began showing up in background shots with a watchfulness that was not appropriate to their age. Nobody told Truly her family was ending. Nobody had to. She was the most sophisticated emotional censor in that entire production, and she had been reading that room since before she could read a book. Now, here's where I want to make a distinction that I think matters enormously to understanding this story, and that I don't think gets made clearly enough in the SisterWives conversation. The adults on this show, Kody, Christine, Mary, Janelle, Robin, are all, in their various ways, trained reality television subjects. That is not an insult. It is simply a fact of having filmed your life for over a decade. You learn, consciously or not, which version of yourself you present to which camera angle. You learn what to say for the confessional and what to let play out naturally. You learn the rhythms of production, the moments when the cameras are rolling hot versus when they're just maintaining coverage. This creates a performance layer not necessarily deceptive, just managed, that sits between the audience and the raw truth of what's happening. Children cannot sustain that performance layer. They simply do not have the neurological development or the learned behavior to manage the presentation over time. What you see in a child on a reality television show is, with very few exceptions, exactly what's happening internally. Their silences are real silences. Their questions are real questions. Their discomfort is genuine discomfort. This means that if you want to understand what was actually happening in the Brown household during the years when everything was quietly collapsing, the most reliable source of information is not Kody's confessionals. It's not Christine's carefully worded explanations. It is truly Brown's background appearances, her unguarded moments, the questions she asks that the adults around her clearly wish she hadn't asked on camera. The comments she makes in that completely matter-of-fact way that children have when they're describing their reality without any awareness that the reality is being contested. There is a moment, and if you've watched season 15, you know the kind of moment I'm describing, even if you can't place the exact clip, where it truly makes a comment about her father's absence that is phrased not as a question and not as a complaint, but as a statement of permanent condition. She's not asking when Daddy will be back. She is describing a world in which Daddy not being there is simply the baseline state of things. She was 7 years old, and what she said was more honest than anything said in that season's confessionals by any adult. That moment matters because of what it represents developmentally. There is a progression in how children process parental absence, and understanding that progression tells you exactly where Truly was in her comprehension of what was happening to her family. In the early stages, a child asks when. When is Daddy coming home? When will I see him? The question is oriented toward reunion. It assumes return. It lives inside hope. Then there is a transition period, and this transition is not gradual. It tends to be relatively abrupt, where the question changes from when to why. Why doesn't Daddy come? Why isn't he here? The shift from when to why represents a child crossing a cognitive and emotional threshold. They are no longer assuming a return. They are beginning to analyze absence. They are asking for an explanation rather than a timeline. Christine Brown has described this shift in interviews. She has talked about the moment she realized that Truly's questions had changed character, that her youngest daughter was no longer waiting for her father the way a child waits for something they know is coming, but was instead trying to make sense of something that felt permanent and unexplained. Christine has said, in her own words across various interviews and podcast appearances, that Truly's questions were part of what clarified the cost of staying. Let me be precise about what that means, because I think it's important. Christine is not saying that Truly pressured her to leave. She is saying something more subtle and more devastating, that hearing her daughter's questions change from when to why made visible to her a cost that had been abstract until that moment. She could absorb her own pain. She had been absorbing her own pain for years. But when that pain made its way into the questions her 7-year-old was asking about her own father, it became real in a different way. It became something she could not rationalize or defer. Truly's perception of the marriage's end did not cause Christine to leave, but it did make the leaving legible in a way that Christine's own suffering alone had not. And here is something that I want to pause on, because this is the angle that almost nobody covers. And I think it's the most important thing to say about Truly Brown's situation. There is a significant body of research on how children fare in the aftermath of family dissolution, and one of the most counterintuitive findings in that research concerns clarity. Children who had accurate understanding of what was happening during the dissolution, who were not shielded with false narratives, who were not told everything was fine until it suddenly and catastrophically wasn't, those children tend to show significantly better long-term adjustment than children who were actively deceived about the stability of their family until the moment of collapse. Think about what that means for Truly. Her early awareness of what was happening, her early and accurate reading of the marriage's deterioration, is painful. Of course it is painful. No one is arguing that a 7-year-old child should have to carry that knowledge. But what the research suggests is that having carried it, having lived in reality rather than in a maintained fiction, may actually be one of the things that protects her going forward. She was never told the story of a perfect family and then had that story taken away. She lived in the actual story, as it was actually happening. That is a brutal education. But it is not the education of someone who will spend their adult life unable to trust their own perceptions. She has already proven that her perceptions are accurate. She knew before the adults told her. She knew before Christine announced it publicly. She knew before the network had to figure out how to frame it for the audience. Truly, Brown's early clarity about her parents' marriage may be the very thing that protects her as an adult. She was never lied to long enough to build her identity on a false foundation. That is an accidental gift from an awful situation, and it is the most generous interpretation of a genuinely painful chapter in a child's life. We are only halfway into this story, and the second half is where it gets uncomfortable, because we haven't yet talked about what Kody Brown's post-divorce narrative does, specifically to the children who witnessed everything. We haven't talked about the specific way his public framing erases what truly experienced. We haven't talked about what the SisterWives fandom, the long-term analysts, the Reddit threads, the YouTube deep divers identified in the Brown children years before the divorce made any of it undeniable. And we haven't made the prediction yet, the one about who truly Brown is going to become, and why that outcome is going to make one parent profoundly proud and one parent profoundly uncomfortable. That is all coming. Stay with me. Let's talk about Kody Brown's post-divorce narrative, because this is where the story stops being just sad and starts being something more specific, something that deserves to be named clearly and examined without flinching. After the divorce became public, after Christine's departure was processed through the final seasons of SisterWives, Kody Brown did something that is worth paying very close attention to. He grieved publicly, and there is nothing wrong with that. On its face, grief is real, loss is real, and the collapse of a family structure that someone spent decades building is genuinely painful, regardless of how that collapse came about or who bears responsibility for it. None of that is in dispute. What is worth examining is the specific shape of how Kody talked about his loss. Because in interview after interview, in confessional after confessional, in the narrative he offered to the cameras and through them to the audience, there is a consistent and striking absence. Kody talked about the family he had. He talked about the life he built. He talked about the vision he carried. This idea of a plural family, a legacy, a way of living that he believed in and that he felt was dismantled around him. He talked about what was taken from him. What he did not talk about, what he has never, in any public forum I have found, directly acknowledged, is what his children witnessed. Not in general terms, not in the abstract, what his specific children experienced in real time as the marriage deteriorated. What truly experienced. And this matters enormously. Not because Kody is required to perform his parenting for public consumption, but because the absence of that acknowledgement reveals something about how he has framed the story to himself. In Kody Brown's telling of his own life, the children are recipients of his tragedy. They are people to whom something happened, the loss of their family structure because of choices made by adults around them. They are acted upon. They are not, in his framing, independent people who had their own complete and sophisticated experience of the collapse, who watched, who understood, who asked questions that nobody adequately answered, who changed their language from when to why, and had that change go unremarked upon by their father. Truly, Brown's clarity, her early, accurate, embodied understanding of what was happening to her family, has never been acknowledged by the man whose choices were the primary subject of that understanding. She read him correctly. She read the situation correctly. She was more accurate in her perception of the marriage's future than most of the adults around her. And he has never said publicly anything that suggests he is aware of this, that he understands what she carried, that he has any conception of what it cost a 7-year-old girl to grow up in a house where the emotional reality and the official narrative were two different things, and to somehow hold both simultaneously. That is not a minor omission. That is a window into something. Now, I want to bring the audience into this because the SisterWives fandom is not passive. It never has been. And I think the community deserves credit for something it got right years before anyone was willing to say it officially. Long-form SisterWives analysts, the YouTube channels that were going deep on this show before going deep on reality TV was considered legitimate content. The Reddit threads that ran to hundreds of pages of episode-by-episode breakdown, the fans who had been watching since season 1 and had the receipts organized. These people identified something about the Brown children years before the divorce, years before Christine's announcement, years before any of it became undeniable. What they noticed, and if you were in those spaces you remember this conversation, was that Christine's children specifically displayed a pattern of behavior that had a name in the comments, even before anyone applied the clinical language to it. They were too careful, too attuned, too emotionally managed for their ages. The way they navigated questions about their father, the way they answered things beat too slowly, with a watchfulness that suggested they were checking something internally before they spoke. The way the older ones had clearly learned, somewhere along the way, that certain answers were safer than others. These are the behavioral signatures of children who have been doing emotional labor in their household that children should not be doing. Children who have learned to read adult emotional states with precision because their environment required that skill of them. Children who are, in the clinical language, parentified to some degree, not necessarily in the sense of taking on practical responsibilities, but in the sense of having developed an acute and protective sensitivity to the emotional needs and states of the adults around them. The fandom called it. Not always in those exact terms, not always with the research vocabulary, but the observation was there. It was widespread, and it was correct. And Truly Brown, as the youngest of Christine's children, as the one who had the least time to learn the performance layer that her older siblings had developed across more seasons of filming, was the clearest and most visible example of this pattern. She was the one who asked the questions out loud that the older kids had learned to keep internal. She was the one whose face registered things before her brain could intervene and manage the expression. She was the one who, in background shots across multiple seasons, could be seen watching the adult interactions in the room with a quality of attention that was, there is no other word for it, professional. Not childlike curiosity, something more calibrated than that. Something that had been trained by necessity into a very young person. The audience saw this. The audience has been talking about this for years. And the audience was right. Here's what I find most interesting about the community's read on Truly specifically. Several of the most thoughtful analysts in this fandom, and I'm talking about people who have put in the actual hours, who can timestamp and cross-reference across 15 seasons of content, noted that Truly's background behavior was not just emotionally intelligent, but strategically intelligent, in a way that distinguished her even from her older siblings. She was not just absorbing the room, she was, on some level, managing it, making small adjustments, staying close to Christine in moments of tension, redirecting conversations with questions that were innocent on the surface, but functionally changed the subject at precisely the right moment. Whether any of that was conscious is almost beside the point. Conscious or not, a child who develops those skills is a child who developed them because they were needed. And a child who needed those skills in their own home at age 6 and 7 is a child whose home required navigating. The audience saw it. The data was there. The production team, bless their hearts, kept filming it. Now let me make the prediction. And I want to be clear that this is analysis, not prophecy. But it is analysis grounded in developmental psychology, in what we know about the long-term trajectories of children with this particular kind of early experience, and in everything the show has given us about who Truly Brown already is. Truly Brown will grow up to be extraordinarily difficult to deceive. That sounds simple. It is not simple. What I mean is this. The primary skill she spent her formative years developing, reading the gap between what someone is presenting and what is actually happening, is one of the most sophisticated cognitive and emotional skills a human being can possess. It is the skill that therapists spend years trying to develop in their clients. It is the skill that distinguishes people who build genuinely intimate relationships from people who repeatedly find themselves in relationships that look right but feel wrong. It is, in its highest form, a kind of emotional integrity, the ability to trust your own perception of a situation, even when the official narrative is telling you something different. Truly Brown has been practicing that skill since she was in preschool, not by choice. Not because anyone designed it that way, but because her environment demanded it of her, and she rose to that demand in the way that children do, quietly, completely, and with a thoroughness that adults consistently underestimate. She will recognize performance versus genuine presence almost instantly. She learned that distinction at the feet of a master of performance without presence, and that education, however brutal, was complete. She will walk into rooms and know things about the dynamics in those rooms before anyone has said anything to her directly. She will be the friend who sees the relationship problem before the person in the relationship does. She will be the partner who is genuinely difficult to bullshit, not because she's suspicious or guarded, but because she has an internal calibration for authenticity that most people simply do not develop. And here is the specific thing I want to say about Truly's relationship with her mother going forward. because I think this dynamic is going to be one of the most interesting things to watch in whatever version of public life these two share. Christine Brown, in Leaving, modeled something for Truly that is extraordinarily difficult to model and almost impossible to overstate the importance of. She modeled the act of choosing reality over narrative, deciding that her own experience of loneliness, her assessment of what the marriage had become, was more trustworthy than the official story she had been asked to maintain. She left not when the situation became publicly undeniable, but when her private truth became something she could no longer responsibly ask her youngest daughter to live inside. Truly watched that. She was old enough to watch it, and what she saw was her mother choosing honesty over comfort, reality over performance, and her daughter's well-being over the social and religious cost of admitting that the marriage was over. That is a blueprint. An imperfect one, all blueprints are, but a genuine one. And children build their understanding of what is possible in a life, of what choices look like, largely from the blueprints their parents lay down in moments of genuine crisis. Christine Brown's blueprint, in that moment, said, "Your perception matters. Your experience is real. When something is over, you are allowed to name it. You are allowed to leave." Truly, Brown received that message at an age when it will be foundational. Not decorative, not peripheral. Foundational. The prediction, then, is this. Truly Brown will grow into an adult who builds genuine relationships, not performed ones, who chooses people who are actually present over people who are impressively charming, who trusts her own reading of a room, even when everyone around her is telling a different story, who does not confuse longevity with health or familiarity with love, who, when something is over, will find the language for it relatively quickly, because she watched someone she loved model exactly that courage. Christine Brown will be profoundly proud of the person Truly becomes. She will recognize in her daughter the skills that cost them both something significant, and she will be able to watch those skills serve Truly in a life that Christine herself is still building toward. And Kody Brown will find, if he ever has the kind of honest relationship with his youngest daughter that requires him to truly be seen by her, that she is not someone who can be managed, redirected, or charmed out of her own perception. She will see him clearly. She always has. The difference is that as an adult, she will have language for what she sees, and she will no longer be a child who needs to stay quiet about it. That is not a cruel prediction. It is simply the logical conclusion of who Truly Brown already is. A child who has been reading reality accurately since she was too young to understand why that skill was being asked of her. Before I get to the final thing I want to say, I need to address something directly, because I think it matters and I don't want to skip past it. There will be people in the comments who always feel that analyzing a child this closely, even a child who appeared on a nationally broadcast reality television show across multiple seasons, is inappropriate. That Truly Brown deserves privacy. That we should not be making predictions about her future or excavating the meaning of her childhood behavior. I understand that instinct, and I don't think it comes from a bad place. But here's my response to it. Truly Brown was placed in front of cameras by the adults responsible for her. Her behavior, her questions, her silences were broadcast to millions of people across 15+ seasons of network television. The production team made choices about what to include. The network made choices about what to air. The adults in her life made choices about what it meant to raise a child in that environment. None of those choices were made by Truly. What we are doing here, examining what she showed us, taking seriously what her behavior communicated, refusing to look away from what the cameras recorded, is not exploitation. It is the opposite of looking away. It is insisting that what she communicated was real and worth understanding, rather than treating her as wallpaper in her own family's story. The exploitation already happened. We are just choosing to actually see what it is documented. The adults who controlled the cameras decided that Truly's unguarded moments were worth filming and airing. We can at minimum decide that those moments were worth taking seriously. Now, here's the final thing. There's an episode, and I have been sitting on this for longer than I should have, because I wanted to make sure I had the full context before I brought it to this community, that has been in plain sight for approximately 6 years, and that completely reframes a core assumption this fandom has made about who was actually protecting Truly Brown during the worst of it. Not who everyone assumes, not the person who gets credited, someone who was operating quietly, without recognition in the background of shots that most viewers fast-forwarded through without registering what they were seeing. I am bringing that video to this channel next. Full breakdown, time-stamped, with the context that makes it land the way it should. If you have been watching Sister Wives since the early seasons, this is going to rearrange something you thought was settled. If you are newer to the fandom, this is going to give you a lens for rewatching that changes almost everything. That video goes to subscribers first. So if you are not subscribed, right now is the moment. Hit subscribe. Hit the notification bell because I do not want this one disappearing into the algorithm. It is too important and too specific to miss. And before you go, I genuinely want to hear from you in the comments. Not a general reaction, something specific. Was there a moment, one particular moment, one scene, one episode, where you were watching Sister Wives and you looked at Truly specifically and thought, this child sees everything that is happening in this room? Tell me about that moment. Describe it. Timestamp it if you have it, because I believe this community has been noticing things that the production team deliberately chose not to underline. And I want those observations on record. The audience has been right about this family more consistently than the network's own framing has been. You were right about the children. You were right about Truly. And the receipts are coming. Like this video if you believe that children deserve to be taken seriously, not protected from the cameras that were already pointed at them, but genuinely seen by the people watching. Because Truly Brown showed us exactly who she was, exactly what she understood, across 15 seasons of footage. The least we can do is actually look. I'll see you in the next one.